During the 1960s and 1970s, the United States underwent many social changes. The era of conformity had begun in the 1950s as an attempt to get back to normal life after World War II. This included women leaving their jobs to go back into homes, Black people returning to a segregated country they fought for, and gay people returning to a country they could not marry in. This sparked many movements for change in the 1960s because people wanted equality for all, especially after witnessing the imposition to others' rights across the sea during the war. The three most notable movements were the Black Rights Movement, the Women's Rights March, and the Gay Rights Movement, which all influenced each other in their tactics. Marsha P. Johnson was one of the most prominent figures in the gay rights movement. She was a main leader in the Stonewall riots while she was working as a drag queen. After the riots, she led the gay rights movements in protests, sit-ins, and AIDS awareness speeches. Her leadership in the movement had a lasting impact that inspired the government to eventually pass a law granting the right to gay marriage in 2015. During the 60s, civil rights movements were sweeping the country as people fought for equality. Members of the LGBTQ community did not have the right to marry or transition despite there being a flourishing community. There were many discriminatory laws, specifically in New York, that prohibited service to gay people. For example, a law in New York in the 60s prohibited bartenders from selling liquor to LGBTQ members. Marsha P. Johnson moved to New York after high school so that she could be near her community and escape her homophobic hometown. Marsha was homeless for a couple years when she first moved and slept on friends' couches. Marsha, like many transgender and gay youth, had to turn to sex work. She was jailed, abused, raped, and even shot once because of the dangers of her job. However, it was hard for LGBTQ people to find jobs at the time because there were many laws that prohibited people from hiring gay people. This stigma against hiring LGBTQ people stemmed from the Lavender Scare, which was branched off the Second Red Scare in the 40s and 50s. The Lavender Scare was a widespread panic that led to interrogations based on fear that there were many members of the LGBTQ community in the government, along with communists. This was not untrue, because the government was one of the only professions where personal life was not looked into for lower positions. Trials were held and many members and non-members of the community were fired from their jobs. Government jobs became more interested in employees' personal lives after the scare, and many other jobs did as well. It became extremely difficult for members of the community to obtain or hold jobs. This was one of the many reasons Marsha had to turn to sex work, because as was the case for many gay people, it was the only job she could acquire. Eventually, she left sex work and got a job as a drag queen in a place close to where the Stonewall riots would eventually occur. Marsha was working when the riots started. Marsha told a reporter, "The only reason they tolerated the transgender community in some of these movements was because we were gung-ho. We were frontliners. We didn't take no shit from nobody. We had nothing to lose. You all had rights. We had nothing to lose. I'll be the first one to step on any organization, any politician's shoes, if I have to get the rights for my community." This feeling led to Marsha taking charge in the riots. No reports of her efforts during the riots are the same. One account stated that Marsha climbed a light pole and hit officers with her bag. Another wrote that she was throwing broken glass at officers on the front lines and helping civilians who were hurt. However, all accounts agree that she was one of the main leaders and instigators in the riots for all 6 days. This was her rise to fame and sparked her activist career. After the riots, Marsha began to lead many protests with other activists. Marsha and Sylvia Ray Rivera stood on the front lines at the City Hall for gay rights. Sylvia and Marsha led many marches and programs together and were seen as the two leaders of the movement. One of the most influential protests they led is depicted in a New York Times article. The article talks about the protest in New York where Marsha, Sylvia, and other gay activists led a march from Greenwich to Central Park. The very presence of Marsha was powerful, and many protesters claimed that they got the courage to stand because of her bravery. While the article does not directly talk about Marsha, all other accounts link her to being one of the main leaders in that landmark march. Marsha, in addition to marches, led sit-ins, which were inspired by the Black civil rights sit-ins. People led by her walked into a bar or restaurant, declared themselves as gay, and demanded to be served until the owner, out of fear of being shut down, called the cops. Then the people who were arrested would sue or take the case to court, arguing it was unconstitutional. Without Marsha's leadership and ideas, the sit-ins would not have been as effective and organized. When the AIDS epidemic in the 80s started, Marsha contracted HIV, which developed into AIDS. The virus affected more gay people than it did straight people, and because of this, a stigma around gay people and AIDS developed. Marsha frequently spoke about AIDS and succeeded at changing many ignorant people's minds and fears. While speaking about the facts of AIDS, she also spoke about the epidemic of homeless LGBTQ youth. Marsha started taking in and helping homeless members of the community and also finding them jobs. Her work inspired many other members of the community to do the same. Because of the inspiring work Marsha P. Johnson did, she caught the eye of the famous artist Andy Warhol. Andy's painting of Marsha was in his collection titled Ladies and Gentlemen. The collection was about the gay rights movement, and according to an article written by the New York Times, Andy was inspired by the courage and dedication of Marsha. He decided to help the movement through his famous paintings because of Marsha's work. The painting had a major impact, with Marsha gaining more influence and the movement gaining more traction. She gained so much influence that she was invited to sit in the front car during New York's first Pride Parade, which she consented to. The parade would not have happened without her leadership in the movement and her influence in the front car. Unfortunately, on July 6, 1992, Marsha's body was found in the Hudson River. The police ruled it a shut-and-close case and decided that she had killed herself because of her struggle with mental health in the past. Close friends of Marsha, including Sylvia, said that the police did not investigate the mysterious circumstances of her death. Marsha had a blunt wound to the back of her head, which the coroners ruled as the cause of death. Her friends found this odd and demanded the case be reopened. It would not be until 2017 that the case would be reopened, but it was too cold to find any new evidence. The LGBTQ community was outraged about her death. The church where her funeral was held had people lined up out of it all the way down the block to pay their respects. The community held protests and rallied along with Marsha's friends to get justice for the clearly poorly handled case of Marsha P. Johnson. Even though they were unsuccessful, the impact of her passing and her life was clearly stated. She was the main figure in the community and an inspiration to all people who protested the handling of her death and went to her funeral. Her obituary was featured in a newspaper, where it highlighted Marsha's work in the movement and a call to action for the investigation of her death. This was a big deal because not many gay, trans, or people of color were put in obituary sections of newspapers. But she, a Black trans woman, was featured and honored. Marsha P. Johnson's impact on the movement was vital to the life of the movement and to the mending of the bridge between straight and gay people. She tirelessly dedicated her life to the movement, and as seen by her funeral and life's work, had a huge impact on the community. Even though other activists like Sylvia had a huge effect on the movement, Marsha, being Black and transgender, allowed her to help more people because of intersectionality. Without her charge at the Stonewall riots and the AIDS epidemic, or the call for the end of oppression in restaurants against gay people, the movement would not have been as influential. Her work influenced the protests in the 2000s that eventually led to the right to gay marriage in 2015. She is honored to this day as one of the main founders of the movement and should be in all U.S. history textbooks.